Hi everyone, good morning, good afternoon or good evening, wherever you're joining us today. It gives me great pleasure and I'm delighted to be your anchor here on PrivSec Global. I'll now be introducing our next panel. It's on our marketing and ad tech privacy focus stream. The panel is entitled Consumer Trust, Consent and Privacy Rights. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce the host of this panel. It's Julia Porter, who is partner on Data Protection Network Associates. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you, Andrew, and it's good to be here today. Let me immediately add my other panelists to the show. So first of all, we have Konrad Shek, who is Policy Director at the Advertising Association. We've also got Conan Chitham, who is the Legal Advisor at MediaMath. And then finally, Romain Gauthier, who is the co-founder at Didomi. And my apologies if I've got any of your job titles incorrect here. So I'll give you all an opportunity to talk about yourselves in a minute once we get the panel started. But let me just provide a little bit of background and a little bit about myself, and then we'll get started. So this panel is about discussing and understanding why advertising technology is being discussed so much at the moment and what the political and ethical aspects are. And in particular, we want to understand for privacy and security practitioners how public attitudes to trust and consent have changed, because certainly there has been a lot of change and the industry needs to reflect that fact. So just quickly about myself, I'm a partner at the Data Protection Network Associates, which is a privacy and data protection consultancy. I started my career as a media buyer, spent a lot of my executive career as a marketing director, and have worked mostly in media and technology business. So I feel like I'm relatively well qualified to understand this topic. Having said that, it's a complex one, so I'm sure there's many things I don't know. I've also worked at ITV and most recently at The Guardian, where we had a particular focus on transparency. And the DPN has been quite recently established, and we've done the 7-step ad tech guide for ISBA and DMA, and I write widely on this topic. So just a little bit of background about the panel. I think what's obvious and clear is that programmatic advertising is here to stay. There's no question about that. It's how we use it that is potentially the topic for debate. There have been a variety of complaints about whether this technology is intrusive or not, or whether we should be thinking more carefully about how we communicate with our customers. And I'd have to say there's often been an unhelpful debate about what we should do about communicating with our consumers. Data protection regulators have been quite interested in the topic, and we've had a variety of different approaches from different regulators, which again isn't always helpful. In the UK, the ICO has taken a particular interest in real-time bidding and introduced an investigation in 2019. That unfortunately is on hold because of COVID. Meanwhile, the IAB have been trying to mitigate the data protection challenges with their transparency and consent framework, which is designed to standardize consent. And I think it's incredibly, it's well-meaning and well thought through. Not everyone agrees with their approach, and I think they have had a steady flow of criticism because of that. The ICO have done some research about how consumers perceive programmatic advertising, and the answer is they don't necessarily understand it. And there are historic low levels of trust in advertising, and I think that is a combination of being bombarded with many messages, as well as potentially inappropriate use of sensitive data and addressing vulnerable people. And I think we saw that through the elections in particular. The industry, though, is moving away from the use of third-party cookies, in particular in behavioural advertising. And I think major advertisers are really focusing on first-party data. And I think our final point really here is that we can't expect regulators to fix issues. And I think one of the key debates that we want to have is, where is the intersection between regulation and ethical behaviour, and how do we decide when we need to take action ourselves, and how do we actually collaborate in order to make that action a coherent piece? So that's the background. Let me now introduce you to the three panelists. So Conrad, would you like to just do a quick intro to yourself?
Thanks, Julia, and welcome to everyone listening today. My name is Konrad Shek, and I work at the Advertising Association as the Deputy Director for Policy and Regulation. So I'm the digital and data lead at the Advertising Association. Now, for those who are not familiar with the Advertising Association, we're a tripartite organisation which represents the advertisers, the agencies, and the media. We see our role as promoting the roles and rights of responsible advertising and its value to people, society, business, and the economy. We also have a key role in setting up the Advertising Standards Authority, the ASA, which is the UK self-regulatory body set up in 1962 to keep ads legal, decent, honest, and truthful. My background is very much in public policy and government affairs, and I spent a sizable part of my career as a former civil servant. Thank you.
Thanks, Conrad. Conan, do you want to go next?
Yes,
I think you're on mute.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me now, I hope?
Yes, just about. You're a little bit faint.
Hi, I'm Konrad Chitham. I'm currently working as a senior data privacy advisor at MediaMath, who is one of the largest DSPs and very innovative in this area. And I have been an advertising and data privacy lawyer for quite a long time now, and I'm now on my third Data Protection Act within the UK at any rate. So, you know, I've got quite a lot of experience in there, and the interaction between real-time bidding and data flows on platforms is what I'm concerned with at the moment.
And finally, Romain, would you like to do a quick introduction?
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Romain Gauthier, co-founder and CEO of Didomi. Didomi is a company specialized in consent and preference management. So we've been doing that for the past 3 years. We are one of the early CMP into the consent and transparency framework. And we currently work with clients in over 23 countries, and our solutions are deployed on over 160,000 websites and mobile applications. So we see extensively on the market what is going on with respect to consent. I think today's topic is really interesting and spot on with what we currently see.
Brilliant, thank you. And my apologies for mispronouncing your name very badly indeed. So,
that was correct.
So everyone, please pose your questions. We've got some really expert panelists here. I've got a few I made earlier. So my first question really is about who is responsible for the risk assessment and risk management. So I think there's quite a lot of players in the market. There's the marketers, there's the publishers, there's the technology providers. They have different issues, different challenges. So who should be really taking the lead on improving the transparency and getting consumers to a place where they really understand what they're signing up for? Can I start with Conrad?
Thanks, Julia. I guess my response would be almost a bit of a cop-out, but I would say this is a real collective responsibility. I think everyone within the chain and the ecosystem has their individual responsibility. We've seen some of the issues kind of building up, partly because you have this issue what they call a principal agent problem, where you've got the agent not necessarily not exactly in line with the principle on there. And you have another problem with the first mover advantage. So if we're not all collectively taking action and thinking about these things, this is where regulators get interested, because what they'll see is an unhealthy market. I think, you know, the best way to really address this is actually try to put the consumer back at the heart of what we're doing, and make that, you know, make it a very consumer-centric focus.
So, Conan, what are your thoughts?
I agree. I mean, the problem is that the chains are so complicated now that there is no one with clear responsibility. The agency doesn't want to take responsibility for what it perceives as either the publisher or the client's problem, and so on down the chain. So we don't have anybody who's clearly, as Conrad said, looking after the consumer, apart from the consumer themselves. And the consumer's asked to make a lot of quite difficult and complicated decisions with cookies and with advertising choices and things like that, which they're not, you know, too complex for them to make necessarily. So what we don't provide as an industry is yet the easily packaged way for those interests to be balanced, I think. So I do think it needs an industry-wide approach. It needs the advertisers and the agencies to join in with the technology providers and the publishers on their sites to move this forward.
Romain, what about you?
I think it's an open question. So from a legal standpoint, GDPR has provisioned the idea of co-responsibility. So I think overall everybody is somehow responsible. Yet it's very hard for ad tech players and from publishers down to advertisers to accept and really understand their share of responsibility. So I think, and the debate was really interesting when we started working on the transparency and consent framework. We had this whole debate around data controller and data processors. Nobody really understanding what it exactly meant. I think we are finding the same debate around the legal basis of legitimate interest, which I think is misunderstood by a lot of players in the market. And so I think I see that this question being answered through case law, so through probably like a data protection authority, taking a deep look at the food chain, the advertising food chain, and seeing and establishing this legal responsibility. Second question is like, what's the opportunity from like an advertising standpoint to bear responsibility? I think for brands, for publishers, it could be seen as an interesting move to accept and really build their responsibility to correctly inform the internet user, and that's something that we are very rarely seeing so far. So I think it's still an open question for many aspects.
So just as a follow-up,
I just would say, just as a side, I mean, what the disaster scenario is the thing from, I think, the industry's point of view, is where the decision is made by a regulator or by the ECJ or by another court. That's going to be the wrong outcome, because they won't make a decision that is necessarily practical for parts of the industry or flows or represents the way the industry. They'll just say it's too complicated, you're responsible, and this is what you've got to do. So that may well be the result if we don't get our house in order, but we certainly need to try and preempt that, I would say.
So you're quite right, Conan. In fact, my next question was going to be, how do we trade off the role of the regulator versus introducing some measure of self-regulation? And I guess there's a question about, to what extent do we think trade bodies and those organizations can help support this move towards better collaboration? Can I start with you, Conrad, because you are representing a trade body? No pressure, but what are your thoughts on this?
No, absolutely right. I think the trade bodies do have a key role in this, because there's a lot of complex information, and kind of like touching some of the points that Romain and Conan made earlier. I think one of the weaknesses, and you could also class it as a strength, but at the moment it's more of a weakness in that GDPR is based on a risk-based principle. So it's very difficult to get clarity from regulators to say what's okay and what's not, because then they're throwing back the question back on the individual companies to say, well, you need to assess the risk. And it's very hard, if you don't have that case law in the background, to make an appropriate judgment. I think where companies obviously don't have the bandwidth and the resources necessary to understand everything, there's definitely a role for trade bodies to go in and try to help disseminate, also, and this goes both ways as well, explaining and talking to the regulator. We have a pretty good relationship with the ICO and touch base on once in a while. And I think the ICO kind of appreciate this dialogue and the outreach that we have, and able to talk to individual members and talk to things and try to find an appropriate situation. I mean, there's one specific issue, particularly from the ad tech investigation, was this idea that the ICO thought that a lot of data controllers or processors in terms of their data impact assessments were not mature enough. Now, interestingly, a lot of people tried to base their template, their assessment, on the ICO's template that was put on their website. But the ICO made it very clear that's not right. It has to be done according to specific circumstances. And you can see that that just adds more to the confusion, because people just want to know what's okay, what's not, and kind of carry on with their day job. So this is where the trade bodies can get in there and just really help and figure a way through.
Okay, Romain, what do you think?
I agree very much with that. So I think it's the only solution to see like some form of interesting developments appear on the market. And if you look back at what has happened since the GDPR was established, the TPAs in Europe have really like taken a step back and let the industry auto-regulate and see what's going to come up from these initiatives. I think the ad tech topic is too complex for regulators to fully understand it and place the right solution on top of this industry. So it can only emerge from the industry itself. Now I think it represents some form of disruption with what was happening so far. So there is a real question about the ability for some ad tech players to really transition from this past state to a new state where privacy is center in their business. But I can only see this like a solution emerging from the industry itself, because it's too complex for regulators to apprehend wholly the topic.
And Conan, do you have any additional thoughts about how to self-organize?
Well, yes. I mean, I think the advertisers, the brands themselves, need to take the lead here. They are the ones who ultimately, overarchingly, want to own the relationship with the consumer. And I think that they, too often, not all cases, but too often, pass it over to the agency, passes it over to the DSP, pass it over to the SSP. But yeah, and so you end up with that diffuseness. The brands need to be driving this, so that the people have trust and confidence in the advertising they're getting with those brands in them. And everybody else needs to play their part as well. I think that the model which Conrad alluded to of the Advertising Association in the 60s, setting up the self-regulatory environment in the UK for advertising in all sorts of media, was a brave and innovative step and has been a bedrock. It still remains a sort of largely self-regulated industry, but with high standards and with this objective external party. Now that's obviously a particular model, but it shows it can be done even in complex models. And so I think we need the advertisers themselves to get behind this and say, look, industry, we want to build this confidence. You are our bridge to the consumers. How do we help you drive that, rather than saying we don't understand this, we've given it to our agency, we want a campaign that targets these folk, when we wash our hands of it, which it feels sometimes in some advertisers' cases is the approach they're taking.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you make that point, Conan, because the paper I wrote for ISBAR, which is the Incorporated Society of British Advertisers, was all about providing education and information to help some of the marketing teams understand some of this complexity better than they had done thus far. So I think the thing that certainly became clear is that, frankly, most people don't really fully understand the detail and probably also don't really care about it either. And I think that's the challenge, is learning about it and then learning how to care about it and then to decide how to make it easier for people to work. Having said all of that, I do see a bit of a change in that, marketers and advertisers do appear to be getting more engaged now and actually becoming more interested in how they manage their programmatic activities. So I've just got an additional question about data ethics and ad tech. So one of the papers that was issued recently was something from the World Federation of Advertising about the importance of data ethics and how you trade that off against regulation. I just would be interested to know where you think a culture of data ethics fits into this overall world of self-regulation, given that we can't rely on a regulator to help us sort everything out. Can I start with you, Romain?
Sure. So I think, and going back to what Conan just said, brands and advertisers have a real leadership position to take. I think marketers so far have looked at the question too much as a compliance topic and not as much as a customer relationship topic. That's starting to come in their getting conscious about this idea that actually some of their audience might be privacy sensitive. If you look at some surveys that have been done, including one by the Harvard Business Review fairly recently, about 30% of internet users are starting to be privacy active. So from a marketer standpoint, it's also about like just listening to what the customer is saying and taking that into account. And therefore, like for them, there is a natural incentive to be more privacy active themselves and to put privacy at the center of their strategy. So with that perspective, I think it's much easier for them to take this leadership position. If you look at a brand like Apple, who is like making privacy their number one differentiator, that's clearly like a leadership to follow for some brands, and in there I think that analytics fits nicely, because that's just what like a lot of customers are actually expecting from brands, expecting from their daily touch points with the brands. And so like putting like these things in practice through correct consent and preference management policies is just like very natural for brands that realize that it's not just about complying with GDPR or like fairly strict regulations, but rather like responding to customer expectations, at least some customer expectations, in a way that is like interesting from a marketer standpoint.
So that's an interesting point, Romain. And actually, one of the questions we've got here is, how can companies harness the changing attitudes toward trust and consent as a force to aid competitiveness, which I think is exactly the point you're making. Conrad, have you got any other examples where you've seen companies really treat privacy and respecting customers as a competitive advantage rather than a chore?
Yeah, I think you can see what's happening. Beginning with browsers, essentially. So you've seen Apple with Safari, and you've got Mozilla and Firefox taking a slightly different approach to Google's Chrome. Some people within, I'd actually probably say quite a lot of people within the advertising ad tech community, and also the publishers, kind of see Apple's move as being quite aggressive in carving out its position. Now, Chrome is trying to take a much more collaborative approach and talking to people. And it's not just to say, just to defend Google's approach or anything, but I think there needs to be some kind of balance where you need to get participation from the others within this ecosystem, because it's not one sector that you're speaking to. It'd be wrong just to purely base everything on the consumer. You have to also think about the other people within that chain and how they actually, their business models and the revenue models, and see if we can find a situation where everyone can work and get a decent slice of the pie, but at the same time also respecting consumer rights. So I think as long as we have that in mind, I think there's it's probably a better outcome, because the problem is, as I was saying, with Apple taking that approach and Mozilla taking that approach, it becomes it intensifies the competition. And what you don't want in a system is destructive competition. Definitely have cooperative, friendly competition, which is good for the market. I don't think it's good for the market if it leads to destructive competition.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because I suspect the skeptics amongst us might consider that this drive for privacy is actually a bit of a land grab as well, in terms of not allowing data to move around. So, Conan, what are your thoughts? In particular, what's the difference between collaborating so as a sector, as an industry, we're all being more open and transparent and driving consent, versus using it as an opportunity to create a competitive advantage, which is potentially what Apple might be doing?
I couldn't possibly comment on that. You might say that. You're absolutely right, and obviously there's going to be suspicion. The advantage of those organisations is they're in a very powerful position to move things forward if they can keep in lockstep relatively, and they've all got eyes on each other. So if the industry can proactively work with them and help them along that journey, then I think we could actually get to quite a good place, because what they do now, others will follow and do later. They control their browsers. They also control a vast publishing platform, essentially as well. So they've got both ends in there, and all the searching and things that go on within their environment. So they've actually got they are primary players in this. So I think we have to have our eyes open and be skeptical but not cynical, baby, with them, and help them go along the right road. So it isn't just a land grab, and that, as Conrad I think said earlier, the consumer's at the heart of this, and the actual publishers who are looking to be searched for and looking to display themselves, again, also can play a part in that by saying, we want the revenue, of course, but we want these people to be acting with our, the people who come to our site for content to also be, treated responsibly and ethically. So I think there is a movement in the right direction. It could go off in a horrible way and end up with a sort of closed ecosystem for certain ones. But I think that is a good opportunity to get in with these people. And of course, ethics is so much more than merely being legally compliant. It's more than being, it's a step beyond that. It's giving an environment of trust, which, is going to be really key. So I think it's good steps forward, but we've got to help control those boulders before they turn into an avalanche and go the wrong way.
Good point, Conan. So let's just find some of the questions we've got. So one of the questions I've got here is, are the multiple trade bodies within the industry working together to try to create some black and white guidelines for the industry and supply chain? So clearly that's a question for you, Conrad. Do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the simple answer is yes. I think the problem is trying to coordinate this wide diversity of interest in the market. Now, we have a lot of trade bodies within our membership, because the Advertising Association could be considered as an umbrella organisation. So we do have, say, IABN is bar within our membership, and the IPA that covers the agencies, and we've got the publishers too. But you can see everyone has particularly entrenched positions, and it's quite hard. But it takes a bit of time just to try and find the commonalities where people can move together. Because I think where the ecosystem does lack a little bit is trust and trust between players. And if you don't have that trust, it's very difficult to everyone to kind of move first or move at the same time. And it's just trying to get there and make sure that the right amount of information is being circulated around there, make people feel comfortable, where the progress are going. And it's not a case of trying to land grab or take over in someone's remit or anything like that, but find the commonalities and really kind of focus on these things there, because I think if you focus on there, there's lots to kind of be done as opposed to just focusing on the differences. So
yeah, I mean, I think Conan, that's interesting, this point about trust, because there's another question here which is quite interesting, and you see these points coming up quite often, which is like, someone said here, we've talked about the downstream aspect with advertisers taking a leadership position, but what about upstream, starting with publishers who also hold relationships with their users and audiences? So, as an ex-publisher myself, I worked at The Guardian, then, you have a relationship with your readers and you have all sorts of things you want to talk to your readers about, as well as gaining consent on behalf of your ad tech providers to serve advertising to them. So there's a lot of pressure on the publishers. The publishers are very competitive. They're not known for collaborating very well. So I think that's one of the key challenges. But I wonder, Conan, whether you just want to add something else to that about how the trade bodies can pull together, but also what role the publishers might play in all of this.
Well, yeah, I mean, the publishers are, as you say, a much more diffuse market, and they're chasing fewer and fewer hits and trying to support their content and their journalism, and the Googles and the Amazons and the Apples are also very big players in that market. So as I say, they bridge all of these aspects. But yeah, the Guardian has a half page when you go on the Guardian for the first time about preferences, and very clear, but it's still complex, and they're obviously trying to do the right thing. So I think the publisher's got a role. I think actually, though, it has got to be primarily with the big players who've got to come along and move this forward. And I think the role of the regulator in this actually is not necessarily to come up with the regulation, but is to keep threatening and keep the pressure on, because I think they are the external thing. I don't think they've got the solution. We see with things in Europe like the e-privacy directive and the regulation, which has been trailed for probably in 8 years, ever since the privacy directive came out, is they've been saying they're going to replace it. But those things are too big, too thunderous. There's too many political interests to control. But the regulators both in the US and in Europe and elsewhere can put pressures on these organisations to get them in the same room, get them talking to each other, and get them focused on the consumer. So I think that's the role I'd like to see the regulators play: threatening, cajoling, pushing with the big stick, and pushing them through. And publishers have got a place to play in that if they're pulled into it.
And Romain, what are your thoughts on this?
I think publishers are in a very difficult spot because their incentive is clearly not really right now to put privacy first, because if you look at figures, half of their revenue depends on programmatic advertising, so personalization. So if they don't get a yes to the consent question, they lose half of their revenue, and the majority of them go bankrupt. So it's a difficult spot to be in, to arbitrage between your monetization and what you think might be fair and acceptable for your audience. So they are really I think facing the most pressure in the advertising food chain right now. They are also more mature on this topic than the rest of the food chain, because they are also the most visible part of it. So publishers typically discuss in France with the CNIL and go and challenge the CNIL sometimes. So they actually won this summer in France with the French Supreme Court ruling that says that cookie walls might be acceptable when the CNIL said they were not in the first place. So they're actually fighting a hard fight, and I think this benefits the whole advertising ecosystem. Now, we have a lot of publisher clients, and what I find really difficult for them is that the pressure forces some of them to actually launder a bit the bad practices of the ad tech industry, and to do things that they shouldn't be doing if they had a real choice. So they sometimes they're also forced by others in the advertising ecosystem to do things that shouldn't be considered as good practice or ethical or things of the future. So there, I think it's very interesting to look at publishers and to also help them, support them, especially the rest of the vendors should also take care of the publishers, because without publishers there is no advertising, and the real right now the incentive for most publishers is to get rid of advertising altogether. So large publishers are going to put paywalls everywhere and to try to move to a subscription first model. But for some of them, it will just not work. So there is a real vital need to maintain an advertising ecosystem that is viable for them. Otherwise, they are just going to disappear.
Can I just dive in there, just follow on the Romain point, because this is a key issue that we also need to think about, is that advertising is fundamentally funding the free internet. And if we don't save it, I mean, exactly what Romain was saying, everyone's going to go to the subscription and you have this paywall in front of everything. At the moment, we have access to news and content, which is basically funded by advertising. I think sometimes with the legislators, particularly in Europe, they can be a little bit gung-ho in thinking, right, we want to go after the platforms for whatever political reason, and think, okay, yeah, it's the cookie. We're going to go and legislate the hell out of the cookie, not realizing actually the cookie and the personal identifier has a fundamental role in keeping the publishers afloat.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point, Conan. In fact, I was just going to add to that the publishers are in a bit of a bind, really, because, not only is there kind of one of their key revenue streams disappearing, but also they've got some fairly meaty competitors. So, I think the Guardian spent a lot of time worrying about people like Facebook and Google, who have effectively become our competitors as well as our friends. But equally, there is an opportunity for them around they've got a great context. Their content provides context, which potentially is as valuable as it is knowing lots and lots of detail about individuals. In fact, one of the questions we had here, which I think is quite interesting, is lady here, someone said here, could a non-profit organization manage an anonymized database of interest cohorts to serve marketers targeting and attribution needs without having to share personal identifying information? I guess my question to you guys is, what are your thoughts about alternatives to cookies? Contextual advertising is one obvious one, but other ways of targeting which doesn't involve being so intrusive. Can I start with Conan on this one, please?
Well, yeah, I mean, in some sense, none of them are new. Contextual advertising is, where a lot of people started, especially the established publishers, and that's how ITV works, I guess, doesn't it? Really,
yep.
It puts the content around the programming. That's fairly broad brush. I think it's probably not the level of sophistication that people really want in advertisers really want to get to. So how that can be tuned to the level as a substitute for cookies. I like the idea of, and it's being floated in different contexts, of a third-party trust bank, but then you've got to get a lot of people to buy into that, and that's trust with a capital T and everything else in there. So, but the idea of a third-party trust bank where you can tailor your preferences and the advertisers can go and get some data that segments and things like that without actually having that revealed. Enormously difficult to manage, I suspect, and aspirational, but it's it's certainly an idea. Other things are having more personal ID for the consumer, being able to tune within your browsers and things like that. I mean, all of these things require all of the parties, including with the people we haven't talked about, really, the consumers taking some responsibility. I mean, the fact of the matter is, there are options available already. There are quite sophisticated tools, but we as consumers are lazy and they're a bit clunky, and we have to do it when we change browsers or change our phone or get on our work laptop or whatever. So perhaps improving the consumer experience with the portability of their preferences is certainly things that we can look at as well. But ultimately the consumer has got to then take some responsibility for what they display. Because we all quite like contextual adverts when they suit us. We don't like contextual adverts when they don't suit us, they, So it's always a mixed thing. I mean, people say we don't trust all this data, but then they're quite happy to give all sorts of data. You mentioned Facebook, which Facebook, shamelessly used to target adverts at them. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, interestingly, I think there's some quite interesting contextual advertising solutions now using AI to kind of effectively turbocharge the old way of placing a sports product next to a sports page. Romain, you probably know more about this than the rest of us. What are your thoughts about alternatives to the dear old cookie and driving personal data usage?
Sure. So I think first we need to stop talking about personalized advertising as like the graal of advertising. I think programmatic is a much more interesting idea. The idea to transact advertising programmatically and to treat each advertising spot as an opportunity, which can be valued differently depending on what data is attached to it, including sometimes personal data. I think it's going to be rare in the future, but it will be all the more valuable when you have personal data, personal context attached to an advertising spot, and that's I think that's okay to move back a bit from this idea of hyper personalizing everything around us. It's clearly not something that consumers are asking for. I think GDPR is one proof of that. And yeah, overall, we need to just question a bit more the whole idea of personalization and make sure it brings value to the consumer as much as it brings value to the ad tech players in between. And that's I think one of the big questions that was not answered so far, and that GDPR has put in the face of the industry. And so the whole ROI of personalization is really questioned, and so we need to start there to acknowledge that personalization is not the end goal of everything. And from there, we can devise adequate solutions. If you look back at cookies, so the technology that we use to track and profile people right now, I think it was a weak technological solution in the first place, not devised for that. And if we are really looking at this question with a blank page, we can find much better solutions, much better technologies, ones that are don't need identifiers to circulate among an infinite chain of suppliers and vendors. Identifiers that will be that we stick closer to the user and maybe not leave their device and not leave the move to servers around the web. So there are technological solutions to this problem, but I think the fundamental question is around personalization, and we will not be able to do personalization in the future, in my opinion, without the user accepting it, without the user controlling it in a way that is easy and simple, that speaks to every internet user out there, and that's a tech specialist. So and that's the first question to address before thinking in terms of technological solutions.
I completely agree with you. And in fact, the ICO made a big deal about that particular point, which is, the processing of all of this data appears excessive, and there was no real evidence to suggest that it was going to help the business move things forwards by having so much data. Do you have any final thoughts on that point, Conrad? And then I'll move on to our final question.
Yeah, just to say that there's a lot of technological solutions being tested at the moment to this idea of federated learning. So you can have two parties not sharing their exact data sets. You can anonymize, add noise to it, but still retain the statistical characteristics, and then run the statistics analysis on that combined data set. So there's no actual direct transfer of personal information on, and so each party's data remains secure. I mean, there's other solutions potentially having the ad exchange actually happening on the user's device. So again, that's another way we can have a more of a secure exchange and getting the right ads to the person. Now, I'm slightly confused with the question itself, because in a way, having that and not knowing or having some kind of identifier which ties up some of the information. I'm not saying having people's names and all that kind of specific details on there, but without something to tie this up, you will have a problem of inefficiency, where you get a lot of kind of the wrong ads being sent out there, or duplicate ads, because what you don't want is constant retargeting of the same person, and that's another irritation for people. Okay,
thank you very much. So look, quick fire. What can you not get away with now that you could a few years ago? Romain, start with you.
Speaking about consent, which I know well, now you can't just trick people about consent, and
right.
Even if regulators, data protection authorities are not going to fine you immediately, your reputation is going to hurt. So you will get pissed Twitters that will put your name and on the screen and start shaming it. So it's really damaging for a brand or a publisher actually to trick people around their privacy.
Brilliant. Conan, quick fire.
Well, yeah, I think the transparency means that at least we know. I mean, there are a lot of things were going on which we didn't know about, and I think they probably best left buried in the past. And there's all sorts of things you can't get away with now that people did get away with, and probably a horror show. And finally,
Conrad, final thoughts.
Similar point which Romain mentioned before about the concept of legitimate interest. Now, the old definition of legitimate interest was, this is my business model, so therefore that's a legitimate interest. But GDPR has changed that now, so you can't just say, oh, because it's my business model, therefore I have a right to know this information.
Great. Look, guys, thank you so much. We could have carried on chatting for a very, very long time. So Conrad, Conan, and Romain, thank you very much for your thoughts. And bye.
Thank you, Julia. Bye.
Thanks so much to Julia and the panel there. Yeah, that could have gone on for quite a long time. There was some really interesting points there, particularly around the alternatives to cookies. If you were on that previous panel where cookies were talked about a great deal, this added to that discussion, versus contextual advertising, uses of AI, machine learning, really fascinating stuff. Follow us on social media on #PrivSecGlobal. The next panel, which will be in around 15 minutes, is ePrivacy 2020, Cookies and Analytics. We look forward to you joining us on that.